Well, hello, this is Dr. Kathy Smith, and I'm coming to you from Vision International University. And we're here to talk about healthcare chaplaincy today, and we're actually in session 4. And to tell you the truth, I think it's the most important session that we're going to be doing in this book. So buckle up and get your paper and pencil and get ready to take some notes, because we're going to jump into this material here. So we're talking today about assessing and care plan development. Now you see, when chaplains first started being able to go in and care for patients in the hospitals and other healthcare facilities, they really didn't have the liberty, the freedom to do a whole lot beyond sitting and praying for the patients, listening to them, perhaps reading them some scriptures. That was about the extent of it. But you jump forward to the present day, and especially in the last 20 to 40 years, the role of the chaplain has grown or expanded dramatically in the last few years. And the input of the chaplain into the patient's well-being is welcomed by most health facility and their staff. This is in part due to the fact that established healthcare practices have changed in the past 40 years. No longer are they simply treating a diagnosis or an account number, but they take into account the whole patient, body, soul, and spirit. It's called integrated health systems. So I first learned about assessments when I was in nursing school. You see, I learned that they were the key elements of providing appropriate care for the patient. A good assessment and a good plan of care were essential to that. But even before I could start doing assessments, I needed to establish what was the baseline parameters of normal for my patients. I needed to know what was a normal blood pressure, what was a normal pulse, and what was normal respiratory rate, and so on. And in order to do that, I actually took anatomy and physiology, so I would get that baseline information to work with. And then when I went to do my assessment of the patients, I would recognize what was out of that normal range, and I could chart that they were abnormal, and I would have a diagnosis to have to work with. Well, you too have a baseline of information to work with. First of all, you have a personal relationship with the Lord from which to base a lot of your assessment on. You have a baseline. You also hopefully have some theological education as well that you can fall back on, and all that will help you in making your spiritual assessment of your patients. So let's talk about assessments. In fact, you may want to write down on your paper, if you're taking notes, you want to write down assessments and then leave a little space, and then write diagnoses and leave a little more space, interventions, and finally measurable goals. So let's talk about assessments. When I first did my patient assessment, what happened is I would go in and I would get a patient assignment. And when I had my patient's assignment, I would go and I'd look at their chart. I would read the information about what they were admitted for and what their status was. Then I would sit down with the nurse that had been taking care of them, and I would get a report. And they would share with me the data that they had found when they did their assessment and what had happened with the patient during their care. I would be armed with all of that, plus I would get my assessing tools, my blood pressure cuff, my thermometer, and so on, and I would go to the patient's room and I would do my own assessment. I would gather my own data and compare what I had been reported by previous personnel and compare that to what I was gathering. I would have to gather both subjective and objective information. That meant not only did I measure the pertinent vitals of the patient, but I also had to observe, using my subjective skills, to observe and record what I saw with my own eyes. I would need to ask the patient questions such as, are you having pain? Are you having any difficulty breathing? Are you having any trouble getting up and walking when you go to the restroom? All that was vital information that I would gather, not only what I saw, not only what I measured, but what the patient told me as well. And I would take all this information back to the nurse's station, and I would sit down and I would begin evaluating it. And by evaluating that assessment, I would be able to determine a diagnosis, a nursing diagnosis. In fact, diagnoses are created by evaluating assessments and drawing conclusions based upon the facts. I'll tell you that again because I want you to write that down, if you will. Diagnoses are created by evaluating your assessment, drawing conclusions based upon the facts. So I would have a nursing diagnosis, so I would take that and I would record it in the patient's chart. And then I would take those findings to create the nursing diagnosis that would be recorded in the patient's care plan. And then from there, I would have to develop interventions for each of these diagnoses. For instance, I may have recorded in the chart, the patient reports shortness of breath and lung sounds are diminished. Respirations are 24 to 28. The patient's pulse ox is only 82% and they're gripping the side rail. And when I ask them questions, they answer abruptly and sharply. I would take that information that I had charted and I would be able to create a nursing diagnosis of respiratory distress and anxiety from that information, because that's what that was telling me. That was my assessment from the information that I got. And once I had that diagnosis, then I would have to determine what was my intervention. For instance, I might want to make that patient just as comfortable as I can to reduce their anxiety. I may want to try to remember to answer the questions as quickly and honestly as possible to decrease the amount of anxiety they were experiencing. But I would also want to intervene by calling the doctor and perhaps asking for an order to apply oxygen, be able to perhaps get a chest x-ray, and any other interventions that the physician ordered. I would add all that to the nursing care plan. Now, this process that I just took you through on the physical well-being of the patient can also be used with your spiritual assessment. And so, step one, when you have a patient as a chaplain, you'll want to first of all gather all the information that you can before you even meet the patient. Talk with the staff, look at the records if you're allowed to, gather that information first. Then you're going to want to go into the patient's room, introduce yourself, and ask a few key questions that will allow you to do a preliminary assessment of the patient and their needs. You may want to get some basic history, such as what is their spiritual background, cultural background, and so on. These are all key facts, and they need to be evaluated to determine what medical, spiritual care they're going to need from you. Depending on the length of their stay, you may not have the opportunity to go back and assess them further. So make sure you ask all the questions you really need to in that first visit. And you can probably go ahead and in your textbook, there's a spiritual assessment worksheet on page 57 of your textbook. So you'll find that very helpful in doing that initial spiritual assessment when you do it. And finally, in step 3, you're going to take the findings that you have from that initial assessment, and you're going to want to document both the subjective and the objective information that you found, evaluating what they indicate to you and form a diagnosis of the patient's problems. Once you have the diagnosis, you can then outline any interventions you plan to do and then determine what the goals that you are going to set for that patient with expected outcomes. Now, these goals need to be measurable. Now, what do I mean by measurable? I mean, when you look at the goal, you're going to be able to know whether or not you were successful in your intervention. They cannot be vague. For instance, if I were to say, my patient with respiratory distress is no longer going to have respiratory distress, that's too vague. That's not measurable. What I would want to say is, how am I going to know that this patient is not in respiratory distress? I'm going to outline some goalposts. For instance, their vital signs are back to normal. They're no longer gripping the side rails. They are relaxing casually in their beds and showing no apparent anxiety. All of these things would be goalposts that would indicate to me that they're no longer in respiratory distress. It's not vague. They are measurable goals. So, once you've established that, then you have not only your assessment, but you have your intervention, you have your measurable goals. So, you can continue asking questions if you need to and listen to the family's concerns and offer scriptures, even prayer if that needs to be. But once you return, you're going to file your report. And here's a sample report I'm going to read to you that I wrote up. This is a hypothetical one, but take a listen. Patient is an 83-year-old born-again Christian with an extensive church background. They currently attend church ABD and plan to continue attending once released from the hospital. The patient presented to the ER with a deep flesh wound resulting from a slip of his knife while he was carving the Thanksgiving turkey. The patient's wife and the son are both in attendance at his side, joking and smiling about, the unfortunate mishap. The writer notes no sign of tension or anxiety, and all appear to be interacting comfortably. Patient will be released once the wound is sutured and return to their now cold Thanksgiving turkey dinner. The chaplain in this case gathered information, interviewed the patient and the family, and after evaluating all this information, he determined that this was merely an accident and the family and the patient were in no imminent distress. And other than the wound that needed to be closed, they weren't going to need any additional assistance from him. It was obvious that the only intervention needed was a listening ear and perhaps a brief prayer for the family and the patient before the chaplain left the room. The patient and family are going to be returned home. They're going to be able to return home with no additional intervention by the chaplain. So some of the cases in your textbook are not this simple. Trust me. For instance, the story in your book about Jenny, which is a true story, by the way, not her name, but Jenny was having difficulty breathing. And she went repeatedly back to her doctor with this complaint, and he would give her inhalers and so on, but nothing seemed to be helping. Finally, she was admitted to the hospital in respiratory distress. They found that she had pneumonia, even though the doctor had not been able to detect it with a stethoscope in the office. And so she was there, but at this point she was in such severe distress she was not sleeping, could not go to sleep, would not go to sleep. Now, had a chaplain been in attendance in this specific case, he probably would have asked some questions and done an initial assessment and found out that this patient was experiencing sleep deprivation, which was seriously hindering her ability to get well. And the sleep deprivation was being caused by her fear. What kind of fear? She was afraid that she was going to die when she went to sleep. In such cases, you would want to file your preliminary report and then plan to return for a more extensive, in-depth assessment as soon as possible. Because of the problems she was having, you're going to want to get to the bottom of what was causing this fear that she was having and try to resolve it. And if you read in the book, you're going to see that there was an unresolved situation with grief where she remembered her sister had died in her sleep and her sister had pneumonia. And so the commonality there had caused fear in her that she too was going to go to sleep and not wake up. So, you see, the importance of a chaplain cannot be overestimated. We need to have chaplains involved in the care of our patients. And it's a vital, vital ministry today, and it's growing more and more each and every day. So you're going to find more examples such as this, and even forms that will help you do your assessments and your spiritual care plans in the back of your book. And so this is the end of session 4, and I look forward to seeing you again in session 5. And until then, we'll see you later. Bye-bye.